Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. My guest believes that American Christianity is disconnected from its Middle Eastern roots and that Americans need to understand the region on its own terms and to support the people there that share our values.
We want Christians in the Middle East. There are people in the Middle East who want to destroy pluralism, and it's that attempt at making everything homogenous that's forcing everybody else out.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. Many Middle Easterners express frustration that Americans don't seem to understand them or care about them. They complain that our foreign policy is misguided and at best ineffective. Robert Nicholson, a former Marine, knew that real change comes from building relationships. He founded an organization called the Philos Project. Philos is Greek for friend, and he believes that it's through friendship that change can happen. Robert, welcome.
Thank you, Mimi.
So I want to start with your personal story and how you came to found this organization.
Sure. Well, it's a mix of professional interests and also my personal journey. It's actually a faith journey. I am a Christian, but it wasn't until much later in my life, in my early 20s, that Christianity became something I was interested in. I began to study Christianity as a matter of intellectual curiosity, and began to really try to find out what was it saying, where did it come from. And I think for a long time, like most Americans, you think of Christianity as being American. It's an American religion, and your church is all Americans. And I realized in reading the Bible that Christianity is not American, and it's not even European. It's actually a Middle Eastern religion. And it was that one insight that really began a real journey that began as sort of a personal spiritual journey, but actually affected my professional direction as well. So much so that I started to look around the American church and to wonder, so who understands the connection between Christianity and the Middle East? And what I saw was actually very few people did. Even more than that, beyond just sort of the spiritual connection to the birthplace of our faith, I realized that most Americans actually don't know what's happening in the Middle East today.
At all?
At all. Very, very little. They know a little bit about what they hear in the news. Usually it's bad, so everything associated with the Middle East is the things we want to run away from, not engage with. And there's many Christians who are like, look, just leave it alone. It's not connected to us. Let's just focus on America. And what I realized is, as a Christian, that's a problem for me, because this is sort of my homeland in a way, and the people who live there, certainly the Christians who share my faith, need me as much as I need them. And so this was really the beginning of me founding this organization, the Philos Project.
So once you founded it, then what's your next step? Like, how do you create that bond or that connection?
Sure. So a big part of what we do is just trying to bring this message to the American church, really Christian leaders and future leaders. The first thing I did was started to make my own relationships with other people who understood this. And they were out there, but nobody was really connecting them together. So we began to build relationships at Philos. We began to really start working on campuses, in local churches, talking to pastors, training pastors. Really, Philos is trying to build a community of Christian leaders in this country who are serious about their faith, who care about this region, and are thoughtful enough to want to engage and do so in a constructive way. But on the other end, the task is linking this American Christian community with our friends in the Middle East. And that's why I called it Philos, because Philos means friend, and the idea is I and my church can't change the Middle East for the better. But there are people in the Middle East who share my values, and my job is to come along their side and to help them do what they're passionate about. So that's the dynamic that we have at Philos.
You say on your website that the Philos Project is a response to civilizational struggle. What does that mean? Struggle between who?
Whether people are able to articulate it or not, many Americans, Christians and non-Christians, feel that there's something big that's happening. People say things about the decline of the West, the clash of civilizations. People worry about the threat of Islam. People in the Middle East obviously are worrying about the threat from the West. There's this sort of feeling that there's something going on, that we have a problem here on this side of the world, and the Middle East, or certain aspects of the Middle East, are really trying to challenge us. And people worry about it. I travel all over the country. I'm in big cities and very far away places, and people who are educated and people who are not say this in different ways. There's something civilizational happening, and so Philos is trying to really help people think through what that means, especially as it relates to the Islam question. Because whether it's polite to say so or not, many Christians, and by the way, many Muslims, millions on both sides, actually see this sort of West-Middle East confrontation as a Christian-Muslim struggle. And it may be incorrect, but that's the frame through which they're looking. Religion is informing their thoughts, and it's informing culture and informing policy. So, a lot of times we want to pull religion out of the conversation, and I actually think religion has something to say about this moment that we're in.
You've been to Israel and Palestine many times. How are the Palestinian Christians doing there?
It's an interesting question. There's a whole sort of issue going on with the Palestinians. There are Palestinians living inside the Holy Land. There are those who are living far away in the diaspora, and there are those living in sort of the surrounding countries. And while there is a Palestinian plight, really as a response to the failed war of 1948, and there's all kinds of solutions that have been proposed to help the Palestinians writ large, the Palestinian Christians have a unique struggle. And I speak to them often. I speak to leaders in government. I speak to leaders in civil society, in the religious sector. I speak to them in different countries, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in the States. And what Palestinian Christians tell me is that while we are Palestinians and we fully identify with the struggle of the Palestinian people since 1948, we're not Muslims, and we're also not Jews. I was in Jerusalem just about 2 months ago, and a good friend of mine, a Palestinian guy, a Christian guy, I asked him, what are his plans over the next few years? And he says, I'm leaving. I'm getting out. And I asked him, well, why? Why would you leave? Like, he has a great business in the old city. And he says, I'm not Jewish and I'm not Muslim. I just don't know that I fit here anymore. And oftentimes...
Do they feel like they're caught in the middle in this, or...?
They're caught in the middle. They tend to be, while there have been some Palestinian Christian terrorists, they're by far the minority. Palestinian Christians tend to be the most moderate Palestinians, wherever they settle. And so they want a peaceful life, like Christians all over the Middle East, but whether it's feeling alienated from the Jewish state or facing discrimination in their own societies. And there's a lot of stories that I've heard, both inside Israel and the Palestinian territories, but also even when I was just in Lebanon. I asked, there's actually a separate Palestinian Christian camp in Lebanon.
How is that? I find that odd. Do they self-segregate, or were they assigned different camps based on their religion?
So in the beginning, they were all sort of put together. And during the Lebanese Civil War, the Palestinian Christians sided with the PLO. And for years, they were sort of one thing. And this was exactly my question when I was there in Dubai, which is the area where this Palestinian Christian camp is. I said, I've never heard of a Palestinian Christian camp. Like, well, how did this happen? And it was an act of self-segregation. And I asked them, why aren't you down in Ain el-Hilwa, which is the sort of very famous Palestinian camp in Lebanon, or up in Tripoli? And they said, and they were very frank, and I won't repeat everything they said, but they said, we can't do that. As Christians, we cannot live in that kind of society, even going so far as to say, when I asked them, do you even want to go back to the territories, to Palestine? They said, no, I don't want to live, this is their own words, I don't want to live under a Muslim government. And they're seeing what's happening to Christians in Iraq and in Syria and in Egypt, and they're feeling the exact same thing that all of those other communities are feeling.
And they didn't want to live in the other Palestinian camp in Lebanon because it wasn't safe, or they wouldn't be accepted, or?
There's a couple of reasons. One is it's not safe. The camp that I mentioned in the south is actually it's one of the most dangerous places in Lebanon. But it's more than that. There's a cultural disconnect. Religion informs culture, and people live according to their culture. And what they told me is, shortly after the Civil War started, they ended up moving more toward the north of Lebanon, where the Christian community is, because they felt closer to that community culturally and spiritually than they did with the Muslims in the south. So it's a safety reason, it's a cultural reason, and they actually went so far as to say that our greatest sin was sort of waging war with the PLO sort of getting this whole civil war started. So it was a very eye-opening meeting for me, actually.
So the ones that are still there,
Yeah.
what do they want? You said that, and I know you're not speaking for all of them, but you said that they don't want to live under an Islamic government. So then what do they want?
I asked that question, and they explicitly told me they, like so many Christians I meet in the region, want to leave. They want to go to Canada. And I asked them, well, what about Lebanon? And right now, as you may know, I'm sure you know, Palestinians are excluded from something like 30 or 40 job categories. It's a very difficult place for them to live. And unlike many of the others who want to go back or reserving this right of return, the Christians say, Toronto looks really nice right now. So that's, in asking me, because toward the end of the meeting I said, so what, how can I help? And they said, please go back to the U.S. and get people to get us visas to just get out of here. So it's a discouraging sort of thing to hear.
Which would be very sad if there's no Christians left in the Holy Land where Christianity started.
It is. So many Americans, and this is one of the main messages we're talking about when we meet with Americans, who, with all the best intentions, think, oh, Christians are in danger in the Middle East, let's just get them out. Put them on helicopters and fly them to Australia. And one of the things that I say is, first of all, most of the Christians, if they can, want to stay. And I hear that, and this is in Jordan, this is in Iraq, in Lebanon, everywhere. The problem is, practically speaking, they feel it's just not safe for them. So in a perfect world, they want to stay. This is their culture, their region, their language. They belong there. They're not intruders. They didn't sort of find themselves in the Middle East one day. And the second reason is, it's actually maybe more self-interested, but for me as a Christian, and I think even for us as the United States, I'm speaking as the society as a whole, we want Christians and other minorities in the Middle East.
Why?
Why? So the Middle East is one of the most diverse, historically has been one of the most diverse parts of the world. It's a mosaic. People think it's just the Arab world or the Muslim world. It's not. It's an incredible patchwork of different communities and languages, some of them very ancient, some of them newer. And the Middle East has been best when it's been most diverse. The problem of the Middle East, as I see it, or one of them, is that there are people in the Middle East who want to make everyone the same. They want to eliminate diversity. They want to destroy pluralism. And it's that attempt at making everything homogenous that's forcing everybody else out. Christians,
but they see it as this is the way we can have peace and stability. If all of us are the same and we all agree to the same ideology and the same culture, we'll be fine.
That's true.
That pluralism is the problem.
That's true.
That we've got too much stuff going on.
That's absolutely true. And I heard this in Lebanon from both Christians and Muslims, that why is Lebanon such a unique thing in the Middle East? And it is. If you go there, it's such a different sort of country. And both the Christians and the Muslims told me it actually is a historic reason linked to the presence of Christians. Christians tend to moderate societies that they're in the Middle East. They also tend to be highly educated, upwardly mobile, highly literate. Like, they introduce things. It's not just sort of an abstract idea that Christians make societies better. They actually generate wealth, they increase education, and this is historically true. And in Lebanon, I heard more people tell me the same. And I think for me, as an American, when I look at the Middle East, I think if we can build structures, pluralistic structures, the societies will be much more stable. I can't even imagine. I mean, try to imagine. I'm sure you've thought of it. A Middle East bereft of Christians and Yazidis and Jews. I mean, it's a terrifying thought for me.
Do you think, Robert, that the Trump administration will go beyond the talk and actually help vulnerable minorities in the Middle East?
That's a great question. And President Trump very much spoke about this issue during the campaign. And there were many people who voted for him specifically because he said those things. For example, in Michigan, he won Michigan by a very narrow margin, a margin that's much smaller than the number of Chaldean and Assyrian Christians who voted for him in Michigan. And so he has a duty to live up to these campaign promises. Now, is he fulfilling that duty? It's still early, admittedly, but he's not gone far enough. One hopeful piece of news that just came out, Mike Pence, Vice President, announced very recently that the Trump administration has decided to redirect its aid money that's going to help persecuted minorities out of the UN system and start giving it directly to the communities and the entities who are on the ground representing those communities, which
through USAID.
Through USAID.
And why is that better than going through the UN?
There's a huge problem we don't have time to go into today, but it's an accountability problem. Hundreds of millions of dollars intended for victims of genocide and other minorities for the last few years has gone missing, or it's done things that are useless. So these communities on the ground, they hear that the United States is giving money, and they're like, where is the money? We're not receiving it. It gets lost along the way. And so the idea is, and this is something we've been advocating for a few years, being a mouthpiece for the communities we deal with, especially in Iraq, to say, look, these communities know how to take care of themselves. They know their people, they know the needs, they know the towns, the villages, the institutions that need to be built. Why wouldn't we direct aid to them themselves? Why sort of put it through this sort of circuitous route through the UN where administrative costs and corruption.
So Robert, what do you think the Trump administration's policy should be? I mean, besides, okay, here's one thing, is give them the money through USAID, which is more accountable. What else? What's the other parts of the policy?
I think insofar as we're taking these issues ad hoc, the Nineveh Plain for Christians of Iraq, Sinjar for Yazidis, the persecution of Egyptian Christians, or all of these things, so long as they're all disconnected, we're going to keep failing to do anything. Because if you're in the State Department, you're actually making policy. These separate issues really don't matter, and they don't seem to connect, and they don't seem to serve U.S. interests. What I've called on the administration to do is to begin the formulation of an overarching policy to promote pluralism in the Middle East. We've talked about democracy, we do a lot of counterterrorism, but I don't think we've really thought long-term about how to build and how to stabilize these societies from the ground up, not from the top down. So it's a complicated process that will take time, but we need to think about these things in an overarching way. Your question about why do minorities matter? We need to address that and sort of reorient our policies to that end, educational, economic, security, everything.
But that policy has to go through the Arab governments, usually. And do the Arab governments really care about protecting vulnerable minorities, or is it just PR, like they'll stand up and say the right things?
So it's interesting because even some of the worst regimes in the region, when confronted with the issue of minority rights, are very quick to defend their record and say, no, we love Christians, we love Yazidis.
Everything's fine.
Everything's fine. They love it here, right? I hear this a lot. And then you speak to the communities, and of course it's a different story. But that, even though that's a fig leaf for these regimes, it's something to work with. I think, the U.S. does need to work with people on the ground. We can't be coming in and just sort of telling people, they won't do it. We're not going to get anything done. And I think if we can formulate a real policy, an overarching policy, countries like Lebanon, like Jordan, like Israel, possibly Egypt, would actually see this as in their best interest for improving their public record on the issue.
We can have a military approach, we can send lots of money, that's kind of easy. We can have all these educational policies, but how do we get these people to stop hating each other? Because at this point, they really hate each other.
They really hate each other. It's very true. And it's a very dissatisfying answer, but a big part of it is education. So an Egyptian activist, recently we were in conversation, and I was asking him, as a Copt, what he, explained to me how, Copts are viewed in Egyptian society. And he started telling me some really interesting stories, really boiling down to the fact that most Egyptians don't even understand Christians. They're almost like aliens from another planet. They don't interact. And so part of it is just explaining who these communities are. That's the first piece. So there's, to me, if there's an overarching strategy, education, and in a public relations kind of way, should be near the top of the list. I think also some of these communities are just terrified. These communities are so scared. And this even goes for some of the oppressors. The Sunnis of Iraq, for example, they are the collaborators with ISIS, many of them at least. But it's pretty clear that they did that. They sort of joined ISIS because they were afraid of their place within what they saw was a Shiite-dominated country. So all of these communities are afraid. They're all kind of trying to hoard whatever they can get. And the last thing they're going to do is be nice to the guy who lives next door. So I think part of it is
or be nice to the people that killed your family.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you're a Christian in Iraq, and I've spent a lot of time on that issue, you're equally afraid of the Kurdish population and the Arab population. Sunni, Shia, like, it doesn't matter, like, everybody's against you, and that's why many of them have chosen to leave. This is not going to take 2 years. This is a generational approach that we need to take.
But we need to start now.
We need to start now.
Tell me about the Muslim-Christian Roundtable that you host.
Yes.
That's here in this country.
That's here in this country. So, you know, as I said at the outset, you know, this Christian-Muslim dynamic is a part of this whole West Middle East engagement or encounter. And I remember I've spoken to a number of Muslim friends, and I'm always asking people, like, what do you think is what needs to be done, you know, so that, you know, we can sort of lead the way. And many of the Muslims that I speak to, they're like, you know, what I would like to do is to bring together some conservative Muslim leaders and thinkers and some conservative Christians, evangelicals and Catholics, to have like a really honest, and one of the guys used the phrase, a no-holds-barred approach to really talking about tough issues. And when I heard that from two people, almost, it was independently, almost one after the other, I said, okay, these guys, they see something. Because for them, even though Christians have low opinions of Muslims in this country and vice versa, both communities are conservative in a serious way, and they sort of understand the other, but they're far apart. And so their request was, like, bring us to the table. Let's hash it out, even if we're yelling, like we're getting somewhere. So I love the idea. And so I've gotten together a group of Christian leaders, big ones, and it's closed door for now, and Muslim leaders to really, like, say, you know, I have some problems with you, and here's what they are. And I think it's in that sort of setting when we can be honest and not try to, oh, what do we share? How do we, you know, like really talking a lot of fluff. You know, talking straight, I think, will actually move us a little bit further down the road. To me, that's the only way. Do
you moderate the discussion? How do you
Yes.
how do you organize this?
So the meetings are thematic, and they touch on lots of things, and the conversation does tend to meander a bit. But you know, my only rule is to be respectful, even if you're passionate. Be respectful, and what comes out of people's mouths is actually really enlightening. And people leave these meetings and they say, you know, I've never, you know, I think about Muslims a lot, as a Christian speaking, but I've never really thought about it from that perspective. And it's little insights like that that are going to move the ball down the field.
So Philos has only been around for about 3 years or so. What's your proudest accomplishment so far?
To me, the proudest accomplishment is training up young leaders who are going into positions in this country. And I'm talking now about American Christians, young people, and they come from all over the country. Black, white, Hispanic, Catholic, Protestant, Middle Eastern, Christian. These people who started with a passion but had no direction, and they didn't have a place to go. They didn't see a thoughtful conversation happening. They saw a very polarized conversation and didn't feel like they belonged on either side. And so what Philos has done is sort of create a middle place, an address for people to come to learn, to go on trips, to do leadership training, to learn about the issues that they care about, and to do so in like a sophisticated and nuanced way. So seeing these people, and we're in DC, and I see them now, some of them are on the Hill, some of them are in the administration, working in journalism. There's nothing that makes me happier than to see smart, young, next generation Christian leaders in positions, working their way into greater positions, who have a heart for this region and actually have something intelligent to say about it. Just seeing them go out and begin to make relationships of their own, that to me is my favorite thing.
Robert, what's next if you had unlimited money? Okay, the Gates Foundation calls you and says, I'm going to give you whatever you want. What's the next big thing for you?
So the next big thing, it's two-sided. We're always working in this country and also in the Middle East. In this country, you know, I work in the Christian community. That's my audience. In the engine of the Christian community, as you know, is the church. So finding a way, and a big way, to get into every church in America, to train, even for a little bit, every pastor, every priest in America, to just a bare sort of you know, understanding of what's happening in the region, why it matters, and how they can be involved. So we're in the process of developing this. It's sort of a big church engagement program, because if you don't have the church, you don't have the American Christian community. The Christian community is affecting culture, whether you like it or not. In the Middle East, What I'd like to see is a similar kind of thing, building in a big way, and we're doing it now in smaller ways, but building in a big way human networks of people who can come around this value of pluralism, and not only Christians, Jews, Muslims, coming around this vision and beginning to work culturally, not politically, that comes later, but culturally, working culturally across these different communities, across old boundaries, these boundaries of fear and hatred, and to begin to say, you know, you and I are different, and it's okay that we're different. I like that we're different. I want to preserve it, but we can work together on this one thing, to be neighbors and to live alongside each other. So those networks they seem abstract when you talk about them, but in reality, networks move cultures. Groups of people create movements, and those are the things that actually will bring change in the long run. And so that's building out our sort of network on the ground is the next big thing for us.
Robert, I want to thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you, Mimi. Thanks for having me.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. You can also subscribe to our podcast and leave a comment there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.